when you open up the New Testament especially, or the whole Bible, but when you open up the New Testament especially, we discover that the men and women that bring us the story of Jesus, the men and women who actually are whose stories make up the foundation of our faith, were not men and women who were not acquainted with adversity. They were not strangers to adversity, that they faced all kinds of things and yet continued to believe. They faced all kinds of things and yet continued to just steady plod forward with their faith and their confidence in God. That somehow the people who bring us our faith out of the first and second and third and fourth century were not put off by adversity. They were not put off by the seeming absence of God. But somehow that fueled them in such a way that they were even more adamant about making sure that the message of Jesus Christ and the gospel made it out of their difficult centuries to our culture and to our world today. Perhaps the best example of this from the first century is the Apostle Paul. And the reason perhaps he's the best example is because the Apostle Paul never met the pre-crucified Jesus. He wasn't one of Jesus' disciples. You know, we walked around with Jesus. Paul came to faith after the crucifixion, after the resurrection, and after the ascension. Christians believe that Jesus went into heaven. And Paul never met the pre-ascended Jesus. Paul learned what he knew about Jesus mostly from people who knew Jesus. Paul became a Jesus follower after he had been a Jesus hater. In fact, if you don't like Christians, you would really love the Apostle Paul, because however much you hate Christians, he hated them more. You know some Christians you think should be arrested. Paul arrested them. Okay, so that's Paul steps into history as a Christian hater and a Christian persecutor known as Saul of Tarsus. And so he gets permission from the government. Imagine this. He gets permission from the government to arrest Christians and torture them into blaspheming Jesus' name or telling him where the other Christians were hiding. That was his job, okay? And he felt like he was doing God a favor. And then Paul, the Christian hater, became a Jesus follower and became the greatest evangelist of his day and age. And he went all around to Greek cities, the major Greek cities, planting churches. But just as he got his life right with God, to use an old-fashioned term, just as he kind of came to faith, just as he got in the center of God's will and began doing the things he ought to do, after he came back, after his eyes were open to the reality of who Jesus was, just as he was beginning to make good decisions, something really bad happened to the Apostle Paul. And he was stricken with some kind of physical ailment. We don't know exactly what it was, but here's what we do know. It wasn't going away. And it was a hindrance, now get this, it was a hindrance to what he believed God had called him to do. Imagine that you have this, really like this Damascus Road experience. That's where we got that phrase, a bright light shines and God speaks to him and he is converted in a moment and gives his life to following Jesus. And then after he gives his life to following Jesus, he gets this illness that keeps him from doing the very thing that he felt like God had called him to do. And so in his turmoil and in his inner wrestling with God and God why and all that sort of thing, the Apostle Paul learned a very, very, very valuable lesson. And in his explanation, we get this key insight, an extremely important insight for the rest of us who find ourselves or will find ourselves in the meantime season of life. So I want to read you, we looked at this passage about 4 years ago within a different context. If you grew up in church, you may have heard this before. If you're new to Bible study, this may be brand new. But here's what the Apostle Paul, the ex-Christian hater, ex-Christian persecutor who becomes missionary, here's how the Apostle Paul describes his wrestling and his inner turmoil around this affliction that happened to him that didn't seem to go away, one that actually was making it more difficult for him to do the very thing that God had called him to do. Here's how he explains it in his letter to the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians chapter 12. He says this, "Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given." Now, the little phrase "in order to" is one little Greek word that lets us know that this is a purpose statement. So the Apostle Paul says there was a purpose behind this gift. And what's really interesting is the Greek word translated given is the most common word for a positive kind of Christmas kind of birthday kind of gift. That if Paul was sitting around the Christmas tree opening gifts on Christmas morning with his friends, this was the Greek word they would use to describe the gifts given. This was a positive thing. This didn't mean curse. This didn't mean punishment. It was the word most commonly used to talk about the gods or God giving or a benevolent God giving a good gift to one one of the God's followers. So the Apostle Paul chooses his words carefully, and he says, because in order, there's a purpose behind this, to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given. Well, Paul, what were you given? What was this special gift that you got to open? I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. So when I read this, I think, well, Paul, I think you chose the wrong word right here. I think this should be, I was given a curse, or I was cursed with a thorn, I was punished with a thorn, I was, had the bad part of me exposed through a thorn. I mean, this is a positive word and this is a negative word. And the thorn, the term thorn simply means that this was a constant irritating problem, just like a thorn, a constant irritating problem. And the fact that he used this term torment, this literally means to beat somebody up. Like if they were going to describe what a bully did to a kid at school, this is the term they would use. This actually meant to strike with a fist. So Paul says, to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given the gift, thank you very much, of a thorn that just kept beating me up day after day after day after day. And he says it was a messenger of Satan. And translators have struggled with what this phrase means. Some people think that somehow literally Satan did it and God used what Satan did. And, I don't know. Other people think it's a figure of speech. You know how sometimes we say it hurt like the devil. Boy, that hurt like the devil. I don't even know what that means. That just means it hurt a lot. So we don't know if this was a figure of speech or somehow this was a theological statement. We don't know. But what we do know, and what is absolutely clear from the text, is that the Apostle Paul saw this thorn as a gift with a purpose, and it wasn't going away. Some people think it was epilepsy, that while he was speaking, while he was traveling, and while he was teaching, and while he was trying to position himself as an authority with the early church, that he would have these fits and wake up and be embarrassed, and people are, what's wrong? And of course they didn't understand epilepsy back then, and they probably compared it to demon possession or something strange, the gods, too close to the gods or something. Some people thought it was depression, and I'll be honest, if you read the book of Acts, he had every reason to be depressed, okay? In the book of Acts, it's the story of the Apostle Paul. If I went through a tenth of what he went through, I would be depressed. So it could have been depression. Who knows? His life was so tough. Some people think it was headaches. He definitely had some eye trouble. So some people think it was a debilitating eye disease that kept him from writing or reading, and maybe it was painful. Some people think because of the areas he traveled in, it could have been recurring malaria. So the truth is we don't know exactly what it was, but here's what we do know. It was painful, like a thorn. It was humiliating, and it was debilitating. It was painful, humiliating, and debilitating. This is the guy that was called by God to spread the gospel throughout the Gentile world. And after he became a God follower and a Christian, he developed something that was painful, humiliating, and debilitating. That should make some of us feel at least a little better. So then the Apostle Paul, and I love this part, then the Apostle Paul tells us what he did when he realized that this wasn't going away. And the great news for you and for me is he did exactly what we would do if we found ourselves with something that was painful, humiliating, and debilitating. Here's what he says I did. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. I mean, I'm the Apostle Paul, and I get to write, half the New Testament, but I'm not like Superman. I mean, when something's bothering me, I ask God to take it away. And this doesn't mean, I added it to my prayer list on Monday. Then I prayed it, I was praying, thanking God for my breakfast on Tuesday. And I said, oh yeah, by the way, if you get rid of this thorn. This is an indication that there were probably 3 seasons of his life where this thorn, whatever it was so unbearable that he finally fell on his knees and said, God, I cannot continue doing what you've called me to do if you don't remove this. I cannot go on anymore. I cannot do what you've called me to do. I can't stand up in front of people. I can't write. I can't be faithful. I can't go on unless you remove this from me. So 3 different seasons of his life, it was like, I've had enough. God, you've got to do something. Now here's the interesting thing. Some of you have been told that the reason you're not getting any better and your life isn't changing is because you don't have enough faith. I don't believe that. And the reason I don't believe that is because I believe the Apostle Paul had more faith than all of us put together. And simply trying to faith God into something we want God to do is bad theology. And the Apostle Paul, a man of extraordinary faith, pleaded with God to do something that would allow him to do God's will in a more energetic and powerful way. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, and I know for some of you, it would be a major, major breakthrough for you if God would just say something to you, wouldn't it? I think this is the thing that hurts me the most on behalf of other people. That this is the thing that bothers me the most on my behalf. God, if you would say something, I can even take no for an answer. I don't know if I want to hear it audibly at night when I'm in bed, that will freak me out, but maybe during the day when I'm outside around other people. But if I could just get somehow, some way, any kind of recognition, any kind of indication that you're hearing my prayers and that you know what's going on with me. And the first time that the Apostle Paul asked God, he heard nothing. And the second time he heard nothing. And finally, during this third season of prayer where he's begging God, you've got to do something for me. You've got to give me some relief. He said this, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Now, maybe the best way to understand this sentence is to interchange these 2 words, because in this context, they really mean the same thing. You could read it this way. My power is sufficient for you, for my grace is made perfect in weakness. And what God said and what God communicated to the Apostle Paul, which is what some of us need to hear today, is simply this. He said, Paul, the answer is no. I am not going to remove this from you. But I'm going to give you the strength, and I'm going to give you the power, and I'm going to give you the grace that you need to press on in spite of the fact that it's not going away. That literally what this phrase means is my power reaches its full measure. My power reaches its full measure and is perfected in weakness. That my power reaches its full potential, its full measure when you are the weakest. It's as if God said to the Apostle Paul, I'm going to show off my power through your weakness. So the answer to your prayer is no. This is not going away. So now the Apostle Paul had a 4th thing to add to his list. It's painful, humiliating, debilitating, and it's permanent. Oh, and by the way, Paul, I love you. And I'm going to use you. And people are going to name their children after you. They're going to name their children Paul and their dogs Nero. In other words, Paul, I haven't forgotten about you. You are still right in the center of my will. But Paul, the answer to your question of will you remove my adversity, will you change my circumstances, will you ease my pain? My answer to you is no. But no with a promise. My grace will be sufficient for you. So what do you do when you're the Apostle Paul and God, who you're serving with all your heart and soul and risking your life almost every day, says no? And now you have an issue that's painful, humiliating, debilitating, and permanent. And what the Apostle Paul writes next, I'm telling you, I know for some of you don't read the Bible. The Bible's not true. The Bible's made up. The Bible's written by men. That's what your English teacher told you. I get it. I've heard all that. I'm just telling you. What he writes next, these are the kinds of statements I just go, nobody would make this up. This so comes from a heart that was in tune with the will of God in the first century. Here's what he writes next. So we ask the question, Paul, so what are you going to do in the meantime? What are you going to do in the meantime? What are you going to do in the meantime? And here's what he says. He says, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness so that, here's another purpose statement, so that, little clause, so that Christ's power may rest on me. If you have a different translation of the Bible, this word is also translated glory. Here's what he's saying. He's saying, therefore, since this is not going to go away, since this is going to continue to get in the way, since this is going to continue to get in my way, since this is going to continue to be something people associate with me, since people are going to constantly say, I wonder why God doesn't, here's what I'm going to do with this thing that just won't go away. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's how I'm going to respond to this adversity that I wouldn't wish on anyone, and yet God has given it to me. I'm going to boast in it. I'm going to glory in it. To use a phrase that we talk about with our dog, I'm going to roll around in it. I'm going to get it all over me. I'm not going to hide from it. I'm not going to pretend. I'm not going to shield it. I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to dodge it. I'm not going to make excuses for it. If God has chosen this for me, then I'm going to surface it and I'm going to embrace it. I'm going to own it. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness. When people say, Paul, I heard you got this thing. Yeah, I got this thing. Let me tell you about this thing. Paul, I heard that last time you were here, yeah. In fact, that's not the only time it happened. Paul, did you hear about the Apostle Paul? Yeah, but you can ask him about it. It's not a secret. He'll talk about it. It's not a secret. I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness so that, because there's a purpose, so that because there's a result, so that because there's an outcome, so that Christ's power may rest on me. Whew. So what are you gonna do in the meantime, Paul? I'm gonna own it. I'm gonna embrace it. I'm going to allow it to define me so that I can bounce off of it glory back to my heavenly Father. Wow. Now here, there's a little grammatical thing happening here with the Greek. So instead of Greeking you out, I just want to read you the implications of the Greek text around this verse. It's so powerful. Here's another way of saying the same thing. Embracing your inability is a prerequisite to experiencing Christ's ability. That's what he's saying. Embracing your inability. In other words, he's saying, I'm not gonna hide from it, run from it. I realize that in order for me to experience Christ's power through me, this is important, in order to experience the grace that God has promised through this circumstance, I have to embrace this circumstance. Embracing your inability is a prerequisite to experiencing Christ's ability. Here's why that's important. Because for some of us at every stage of life, when we bump up against this thing, when we bump up against those unchangeable circumstances, when we bump up against the thing that's an embarrassment, we hope nobody finds out. It's a disability. It's caused us to not be as whatever it was that we wanted to be. Our tendency is to hide, our tendency is to pretend, and our tendency is to lie. And what the Apostle Paul is saying is this: when I got over all of that, and I embraced this and saw it as a gift, I experienced Christ's power in me. This is why, and he concludes with this. This is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. To which we say, but that's not the American way. To which Paul would say, and that's why you are not experiencing the grace of God in the area in which you struggle the most. Now, all of that to say, I think all of this hinges on the phrase that appears at the beginning of this little piece, but important piece of literature. And it's this statement right here. In order to, I was given a thorn. In order to, I was given a thorn. That God had a purpose and God had a reason. And for God to fulfill his will in this world through me, he gave me a gift, and the gift was a thorn. It was a gift with a promise and a purpose. But I had to see it as a gift, not an enemy. I had to receive it and embrace it instead of resisting it. And once I received it as a gift, it had a purpose in order that. And once I received it as a gift with a promise, my grace is sufficient. Then something powerful happened that would not have happened any other way.
So let me ask you this. Is it difficult to come to grips with the idea that the challenging circumstances we face can come from the hands of a loving Heavenly Father? I mean, when you think about everything that's going on, the ramifications of the pandemic, the job loss, the scarcity, the tension, the anxiety, the oil prices, when you think of the uncertainty that we find ourselves in, and not only the pandemic, but life is happening. Diagnosis of cancer and surgeries and illnesses. Loved ones are passing away. I heard on Wednesday night in our prayer time that there was a friend of mine who shared that she's got a friend who is grieving the loss of their young son. So is it difficult to come to grips with the fact that our challenging circumstances can come from the hands of a loving Father? You know, in the course of conversations, we've been talking about this in the meantime moment. I've had some pretty interesting conversations. I mean, in the moment, it's easy for us to in the moment, it's easy for our circumstances to speak louder than our faith. Another one said, there are times we face problems and pressures that are too big for us to resolve. But listen to this. It's in those moments that ultimately God gets our attention. Had another friend of mine that shared with me that it's not difficult to believe that they can come from a loving God, but the hard thing is, the frustrating thing is, that it seems highly unfair for those around me who are forced to deal with the hurdles that I'm facing. So what do we do with this? In fact, he would go on to say that it's in this moment that he's been pleading with God, saying, God, would you take this from me? God, would you give me hope? Would you show me that you're on the other side of this thorn that I see in my side that I just can't get rid of? And I love the honesty in that. In fact, when we really think about, is God big enough for us to plead with him, for us to beg of him? The ultimate answer is yes. I believe he is. In fact, I love this response. Do you feel permission to plead with God? Yes, we feel extremely accessible to God to share our request. And they go on to say, in fact, we believe that he encourages us to do so. That Jesus is our example. And in those moments before he was arrested, he was pleading with God, saying, God, would you take this cup from me? God, I believe that you can. I know that you're capable. Would you take this cup from me? You know, ultimately, we believe that the challenging circumstances, that as difficult as it is to come to grips with, the relationship that will never be mended, the spouse that will never step foot in the door again. What do we do with this? Well, I believe we have an option. And when it comes to the pandemic, when it comes to our circumstances, the job loss, when it comes to the cut pays that we're facing, that we have a choice of whether or not we want to accept it as a gift from a loving Heavenly Father. And as difficult as that can be, the beautiful thing is Paul, knowing good and well what he had done and knowing the thorn that he had in his side, he made this promise. He said that the gift that God gives us, it's a gift with a promise and a gift with a purpose. The promise is that my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in your weakness. In everything you're going through, my power is made perfect in your weakness. And the purpose, it kind of goes back with what we talked about last week. This idea that when we're in the circumstance, one of the valuable things we can do is to journal about what's going on, and then to constantly be thinking about, so that's why. You see, when we face challenges in life, when we face circumstances, when we face hurdles in life, sometimes it's weeks, sometimes it's months, sometimes it might even be years before we see the purpose. But constantly be thinking, so that's why. So that's why that circumstance was in place. You see, I genuinely believe that in our stories, the story of COVID-19, the story of your life, the story of your relationships, that when we really come to grips with these stories, that on the other side of these stories, God is writing a remarkable story in your life. So before we go, I want to encourage you, and I want to just challenge you with this simple idea. And I know we're in a time of scarcity to a large degree, but I genuinely believe that even in our hurdles, even in those things that are difficult for us to process, that we have a God that has abundantly more love and grace and peace and hope than we can ever imagine. And so I've asked our band to sing one more song with you guys this morning. And my hope and my aim is that this would be a song that is a prayer for us as we continue forward. That we would be able to come to grips, that we would be able to accept a gift like this, but knowing it comes from a loving Father who has abundantly more peace and love and joy than we can ever imagine. And after the band plays, I'm going to be jumping on Upstreet Live so that we can, or on Facebook Live, so that we can continue this conversation, so that we can answer your questions, so that we can process what does it mean to accept these challenging circumstances as a gift with a purpose, and a gift with a promise.
There is healing in the power of the Lord Most High. There is courage in the shadow of his wings. There is peace unending over all my life. There is freedom that washes over me. I find all I need here in your presence, Lord. I open up my soul and you fill me up with all I need here in your presence, Lord. Where blessings overflow, there's always abundantly more. There is rest in the goodness of the Lord my God. There is treasure in the kindness of my King. There is comfort in knowing your failing love, my provider. You set my spirit free. I find all I need here in your presence, Lord. I open up my soul and you fill me up with all I need here in your presence, Lord. Where blessings overflow, there's always abundantly more. More than I could ask or seek, more than I could fathom. God, your love for me is better than I imagined. More than I could ask or seek, more than I could fathom. God, your